What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rantin Review Pro Wrestling. We're doing a list today, a countdown of 10 pay-per-views and special events I think you, as a modern wrestling fan, should see. Actually, it's just really 10 pay-per-views and special events that I think are pretty darn good, that actually do have some historical significance, so I do suggest them to you guys to watch. Before we get into the list, though, I want to remind you guys that this being YouTube, the only thing YouTube likes more than top 10 lists is it likes when you hit the like button. So if you do go down in the description box or above the description box and hit that like button, turn it black, turn it blue, whatever color it does when you hit it, I will appreciate it. It helps the YouTube algorithm let other wrestling fans know about this list and this video and its recommendations, so thank you very much. The first event on this list was actually kind of cheating. It's actually two events. It's from Thanksgiving night to 1987 and the NWA Starrcade 1987. And the reason I say two events is because on the very same night is when the WWF had the very first Survivor Series. Long before AEW and versus NXT in the Wednesday Night War, long before TNA would try to go on Monday nights, long before the legendary Monday Night Wars between WCW and the WWF. This was one of the earlier incidents when the two major wrestling companies in North America actually went head-to-head on the same night. Now, historically, before this night, for 5 years, Starrcade had been a Thanksgiving night tradition that was held as a closed circuit event. This was the first year it was going to legit pay-per-view as well for Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA. They were stretching outside of their territory, taking Starrcade out of the Carolinas and putting it up in Chicago, which, as we know to this day, is a hotbed of wrestling action. And even before that, for decades, Thanksgiving night was a tradition for the Southern Territories to have a big wrestling event. Vince, however, being Vince, decided that he wanted to debut a new pay-per-view called Survivor Series on the very same night. And it's kind of funny, years later, he would offer this up when he was talking about the Monday Night Wars.
If you own networks and you can put a television program on it virtually anytime you wish, on any night you wish, why would you do it directly against us? The only logical reason is just that. He was trying to hurt us.
So through his own admission, Vince McMahon went out to hurt Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA, who were stretching themselves thin at the time by doing this show up in Chicago. And it proved to be, if you have heard Jim Cornette, David Crockett, Jim Ross, a lot of other people on Conrad Thompson's podcast, Tony Schiavone included, talking about this, Ric Flair included, you've heard them talk about how this was the beginning of the end of Jim Crockett Promotions because they had put too much in the basket and got trounced by McMahon putting on a pay-per-view at the same time. And legendarily enough, this is also the night where Vince had told the pay-per-view outlets, which weren't that many at the time and was still in the early days of pay-per-view, but he told them if you carried Starrcade 87 on Thanksgiving night, then you could not carry Survivor Series and you couldn't carry next year's WrestleMania. And none of the pay-per-view outlets wanted to be out of WrestleMania. A few did, but most of them basically shut out Starrcade, so it really, really hurt Jim Crockett Promotions. As far as the two cards, I think Starrcade 87 gets a bad rap all the time, mainly because of the main event, which is very similar, and I brought this up a couple weeks ago, to what's recently happened in AEW with Christian Cage, who's a great worker, but people like, I don't know about him being the main event world champion against Kenny Omega, who ironically enough is, many people have said, I've said it many times, and even the elite are saying it now. It's kind of like an updated millennial version of Ric Flair from the old days. But same kind of scenario. Christian Cage beat Omega for a world championship a couple months earlier. Then at the pay-per-view, they had the rematch where Omega won the match. It's a similar situation here at the main event of Starrcade with Ronnie Garvin, who is a very good worker. In fact, I think he was doing strong style before a lot of people even knew what strong style was in the NWA and Crockett territories. He, through some convoluted storyline involving his brother and Precious and Ric Flair and a dress and a hotel room, don't ask, I'll do a retro review at some point in time, but he wound up taking on Ric Flair a couple months earlier in a steel cage and winning the NWA World Championship and shocking everybody. That was all a setup for, basically, for Ric Flair to win his 5th World Championship at Starrcade 87 in the cage, and a match that is highly underrated. It is an amazing match. If you haven't seen Flair and Garvin from Starrcade 87 in steel cage, you definitely should watch it. There's also a Skywalker scaffold match. There's an infamous Dusty finish where the Road Warriors in their hometown of Chicago went and took on Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard for the NWA World Tag Team Championships. Before, we were talking about Forbidden Doors. Crockett was doing it back in the day, where the UWF TV champion Terry Taylor was having a unification match against the NWA TV champion Nikita Koloff, and a bunch of other stuff. Plus, this is also one of the first pay-per-views that I actually got to watch at home, so it does have a special place in my heart. Survivor Series 87 wasn't any slouch of an event by no means. Again, it was the very first Survivor Series. The main event featured Hulk Hogan with a team of guys who he usually had been feuding with about a year and a half, 2 years earlier. Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. You had the magnificent Don Morocco, who was taking the place of superstar Billy Graham, who his hip injury had put him out of the match. He was originally supposed to be in it. You also had Ken Patera and Bam Bam Bigelow, along with Sir Oliver Humperdinck, who was brand new to the WWF territory, but obviously had a lot of history elsewhere, because 90% of WWE stars usually come from somewhere else. The team on the other side, if you think Vince McMahon is obsessed with big guys now, just look at this team they were facing at Starrcade. Andre the Giant at over 520 some odd pounds. The One Man Gang, who was 460 pounds. King Kong Bundy, who was 440 pounds. And then just to throw it in, you had Butch Reed and Rick Rude, who are not small guys. Both of those guys were about 250, 255 themselves, but they look like normal sized guys against all these monsters they had in this main event. One match that gets undervalued is on this card. I think the women's Survivor Series match, it actually is the best one on the card as far as pure wrestling in ring work. So definitely check out both of these shows. It is a historic night and would prove to be a historic night going forward for the future of the entire wrestling business. While we're in 1987, we might as well go back to another show that happened that year. As I just mentioned, WrestleMania III. I don't need to say much about WrestleMania III. If you are a current wrestling fan and have not watched WrestleMania III, you need to watch WrestleMania III. Still, in my opinion, being a person, again, who's been watching wrestling since '85, still to this day, I consider it probably the prototypical archetype for a big event. The Pontiac Silverdome, 93,000 fans, or 87,000 fans, or whatever you believe the number actually was. The day-to-night transition, the magnificent Intercontinental and legendary Intercontinental Championship match between Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Macho Man Randy Savage, which set the template for today, for all the flippy stuff that people complain about today. Well, that template was set back in the day by Steamboat and Savage in one of the best matches of all time. And of course, the Titanic main event between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, which the storyline about that was a lot more than trophies. Don't let the people who are doing Wikipedia reviews of this event fool you. That storyline Vince worked on for 6 months. It was a 6-month subtle, nuanced build towards Andre and Hogan that went way before the trophy thing. So I have a retro review of that. I'm going to be putting those back up on my Patreon page and here on YouTube, so you guys can watch those, because my retrospective reviews were one of the favorite videos of my prior channel. So, but definitely, you want to watch WrestleMania 3 if you're a new fan. Keep in mind, of course, this is old school wrestling, so it's a different time. If you can keep in mind that you're watching old school wrestling, you're not going to be seeing a bunch of power bombs and tope suicidas and table spots and all that kind of stuff. And you're looking at old school wrestling and you're understanding the way people then looked at wrestling and what they were watching wrestling for, you'll be able to enjoy this event. And you'll also be able to be marveled at the fact of what Steamboat and Savage did at that time and how it has influenced wrestling even to this day. We're going to head into more recent times and 2018's New Japan Pro Wrestling Dominion show. This show was highlighted by probably one of the best matches of all time. I mean, you know what it is. It's one of the best matches of all time. It was the conclusion, as of this date, the conclusion of the Kazuchika Okada, Kenny Omega series of matches that actually drew a lot of attention to New Japan Pro Wrestling during the late 2010s. Omega had been trying several times to get the IWGP Championship, coming up just short, but getting a little bit closer and a little bit closer. A year before that, they had a titanic 60-minute draw, which is the best 60-minute draw you will ever see in the history of wrestling. This time, there would be no time limit. 2 out of 3 falls. They were going to settle it and find out who was the best. Coming into the match, Okada had 1 win from Wrestle Kingdom 11. There was the draw, and Omega got a win on a banged-up Okada at the G1 a year before. But this was the epitome of drama. This match was so good that it had grown men crying. In fact, it almost got me to cry when Omega won the championship, but I had to suck it up and go, wait a minute, I'm not crying at wrestling. So, but it was a dramatic moment. The post-match was great. The in-ring match, the psychology of the match, the way they laid it out, the shocking first fall, all of those things, including Kevin Kelly and Don Callis's remarkable call of this match. It's one of the best things and a very dramatic thing. A match that went almost 70 minutes. You gotta watch it because it's a great match on a great show. So the card wasn't anything to sneeze at either. In fact, the semi-main event on this card was Tetsuya Naito defending the IWGP Intercontinental Championship against Chris Jericho in what I would say was one of Jericho's better matches in his New Japan run. So definitely check out Dominion from New Japan Pro Wrestling from 2018. Let's head back to some big events. WrestleMania, of course, I think a lot of people, especially more modern fans, favorite WrestleMania of all time, WrestleMania X7. I mean, again, much like WrestleMania 7, I really shouldn't have to say much about this. This was, again, much like the event I just talked about, another match in a series of matches between two of the best wrestlers of this generation, or any generation. The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, once again, meeting at a WrestleMania. This would be the second of 3 WrestleMania main events that they would have. This time, the ending, a little bit messed up. Stone Cold Steve Austin turning heel, siding with Vince McMahon. A lot of people have talked about that ad nauseum. I don't really need to go into it. But the rest of the card was awesome too. You had hardcore matches. You had a Legends Battle Royal. You had a magnificent match with Triple H against The Undertaker. You had so much stuff on this card that it is truly one of the best wrestling cards of all time. Certainly one of WWE's best WrestleManias of all time. And a quite significant one historically as well, because on this same week of this show, WCW had closed its doors, WWF had bought WCW, and ECW had closed its doors. So you came into this WrestleMania with Paul Heyman, the guy that ran ECW, being a color commentator, and a bunch of WCW's mid-card hanging out in the rafters, and a match on the show between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon, because of the purchase of WCW and how they turned that into a storyline within the WWF. This is the WWF and WWE at its zenith. This is the pinnacle, the best that WWE has ever been is WrestleMania X7. Historically, you couldn't have written this better. Everything just kind of fell into place, but it was also the events, given the conclusion, that would start an unfortunate trend that would continue to this day of some questionable booking decisions. You can kind of trace it all back to WrestleMania X7. Let's go for something else a little bit new. AEW's Revolution show from 2020. The last show for AEW, the last major pay-per-view before the pandemic hit the world and kind of screwed up everything. But AEW had just kind of found its niche. It was cooking going into the show. The amazing sing-along for Jericho having a choir, the Jericho choir singing Judas to the ring. That whole sing-along to Judas thing had just started before this. Him and Moxley had an okay main event, but the biggest thing of this show is the amazing World Tag Team Championship match between Kenny Omega and Hangman Page as they defended the titles against their friends, the Young Bucks. Whatever you think about the Elite, there's one thing that they do absolutely well is have these great storylines, especially when it's them involved with each other and one fighting the other or a group fighting the other one. They have a very great way of sowing doubt and intrigue and wondering what's going to happen. And even the post-match had the drama in there with the subtle hint of Hangman Page gently placing his hand on the ropes as if he was going to hit the buckshot lariat on his partner Omega, and then Omega and the Bucks turning around and him going, oh no, I was just calling you over. It was just like little stuff like that is just fantastic. This show also had the debut of Orange Cassidy in the ring, which most fans did not really know what they were getting into except for the hardcore and the indie fans. But his match against Pac is also up there for one of the best matches of the year. It was so entertaining that it turned Tony Schiavone, who up until this point had kind of been a little curmudgeony about the new style of wrestling, and it turned Tony Schiavone into a fan of Orange Cassidy. That tells you right there how good this show was. Well, let's stay on the Kenny Omega train here and go back a little bit to New Japan Pro Wrestling. Wrestle Kingdom 11, you got to put that on the list as a must-watch show. Wrestle Kingdom 11 was after the big Western expansion had already started, and we went into the show with a lot of people still kind of doubting Kenny Omega's reign. There's a lot of Kenny Omega in this list. Doubting his prowess as a main event wrestler, as he had won the G1 and was going on to face Kazuchika Okada. Didn't really kind of feel like Omega was going to belong in that spot for a lot of fans, but boy, would people be proven wrong with this one. There are a lot of little benchmarks that you can point to as to how we got wrestling in the 2020s now to be, once again, more than just the WWE. And Wrestle Kingdom 11, it was definitely one of those benchmarks. It was that show, and it was that main event in particular, the first match between Okada and Omega for the IWGP Championship, that turned a lot of eyeballs over to New Japan and a lot of eyeballs over to, holy crap, what's going on over there? And the real thing that I like about it is it wasn't because of a stunt. It wasn't because that New Japan had brought over, one megastar from the WWF or the WWE. It wasn't some hotshot angle with a celebrity. It was simply that you had two guys putting on one of the best matches of all time. That in itself earns Wrestle Kingdom 11 a spot on a must-watch list for modern wrestling fans. And the rest of the card is absolutely amazing too. So you got to see it. Tetsuya Naito and Hiroshi Tanahashi had a great match. The rest of the card was just exemplary of that late 2010s New Japan Pro Wrestling roster, which is one of the most amazing rosters, especially now that we're a couple years removed from it and seeing where a lot of those stars have wound up and how they have grown since then. Boy, they had a roster back then in 2017, and it's just to go back and appreciate it. It's an awesome event. You definitely should see it. As far as great rosters are concerned, you gotta look at the WWE around, or it would be called the WWF at the time still, circa late 1999-2000. Now, late 99, things were getting a little shaky with the WWF storyline. Triple H and the Big Show and Vince McMahon were trading the WWF World Championship back and forth in the last little bit of 1999. Steve Austin had gone out with an injury, so things were a little shaky for a little bit. Even Mick Foley admitted to this at the time. But they came roaring back with Royal Rumble 2000. It was one of my favorite Royal Rumbles of all time. The crazy chairs match between the Dudleys versus the Hardy Boys. Jeff Hardy doing a dive off of the Madison Square Garden partition over the top of the entrance ramp. You had the debut of Taz, which was a big deal at the time, and him taking on Kurt Angle in a great feature match to start off the show. And you had arguably, in my opinion, Triple H's best World Heavyweight Championship match, and the match that, for me as a fan, established that Triple H, even though this was his third reign as WWF champion, this was the match and this was the reign that made me say, yes, he is now a main eventer. When he had a street fight match with Cactus Jack, Mick Foley, that is still one of the best street fight matches that you will ever see. Very well done. It was a masterpiece as far as the WWF style of street fight. So it's definitely one to check out. The Royal Rumble match wasn't the greatest of all time, but it was a fun match with a lot of fun moments in it, involving a lot of the great roster that the WWF had in the beginning of the 2000s. So definitely check it out. I'd be remiss not to talk about the Miss Rumble 2000 pageant, which was basically, back when they could get away with this kind of stuff. They were having a beauty pageant thing. Now, Ivory was part of Right to Censor. I didn't know Ivory had a badunkadunk. And wow. Look, I'm a brother. We like those. We like a little junk in the trunk. Ivory. I mean, I know it's 20 years ago, but Ivory's probably in her 60s now, but at the time, hey, Ivory's looking good. Now let's bring it to, you guys knew I was going to do this one this year. I'm telling you right now, this pay-per-view is going to go down as one of the best of all time. I'm already putting it on the list as required watching, but you know what it is. All Elite Wrestling's All Out 2021 that just happened like 2 weeks ago. I mean, I have not felt that amount of excitement for a wrestling show except for some of the ones that I have mentioned. WrestleMania X7, WrestleMania 3, Dominion and Wrestle Kingdom and some of those shows. This All Out show exceeded some of those shows in excitement. I mean, you had the debuts of Ruby Soho, Bryan Danielson, CM Punk having his first match in 7 years against up-and-comer Darby Allin. You had Adam Cole making a surprise appearance. You had Minoru Suzuki making a surprise appearance. You had, in addition to that, a lot of solid matches, including Britt Baker against Chris Statlander, which is one of the best AEW Women's Championship matches up until this point for the company. You had some pretty strong style matches at the beginning of the show, Eddie Kingston versus Miro. You had a rather solid main event between Christian and Kenny Omega. You also had, of course, the match of the night, which was the AEW World Tag Team Championship match in a steel cage, the Young Bucks against the Lucha Brothers. I mean, I don't need to go into this anymore since the event just happened 2 weeks ago. You guys know it. It's on my list of 10 recommended pay-per-views that all wrestling fans should watch. Let's go into some WCW stuff here. I got some WCW stuff on my list. Great American Bash 1996. Now, this is a little skewed because I was at this event, and this was much like right now in wrestling. This was also that period of time in wrestling where you could feel in the air that things were changing. And in the Baltimore Arena that night, despite the fact that there were only 7,000 people at this show, and the arena was kind of like half full, we could feel the change in the air. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash had just started appearing on WCW television. This was going to be the night that they would come out and confront Eric Bischoff. They cleared up some things, and I remember sitting in the crowd, going to myself in my head, and actually, I said it to a guy who was sitting next to me. It's like, because I was a big WWF fan at the time, and I didn't like Eric Bischoff, and I was saying to this guy next to me, I was like, I hope they punch him or something like that. I know they're not going to do it, but I hope they punch him. Not but 5 minutes later, Scott Hall punches Eric Bischoff in the gut, and Kevin Nash power bombs him off the side of the stage, which at the time looked devastating. Today, you could tell that it was a crash pad and stuff, and Bischoff was very safe on that bump. But at the time, we had all thought they had killed Bischoff, especially from the angle that I was at, because I couldn't see how far down he fell when he got powerbombed off the stage. But that was one of the biggest moments in WCW history, and a big sign that things were changing in the wrestling world. This show also had a tremendous undercard with it. It was Rey Mysterio's first match in America on pay-per-view. He was taking on Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight Championship. He had a pretty solid wrestling match between Sting and Lord Steven Regal at the time. The main event between Luger and the Giant was not much to write home about outside of the fact that Luger almost racked the Giant, which was a big deal at the time. The highlight match of the night, though, which we're not allowed to talk about sometimes, but I guess we are now, was, and I'll never forget this one, Chris Benoit taking on Kevin Sullivan in that street fight where they battled up into the crowd, into the bathroom. I went into the bathroom and watched them fight in there, and then back out to the arena. And then the great storyline that they had been teasing for all this time, that the Horsemen were falling apart, and Arn Anderson didn't like Chris Benoit starting this fight with the Dungeon of Doom, and Arn Anderson was more siding with Kevin Sullivan than he was with Benoit. So after the match, Benoit was beating up on Sullivan. Arn Anderson comes in, pulls him by the hair, throws him off of Sullivan. Benoit gets up and like, what's up? Arn Anderson's like, wait. Kicks Kevin Sullivan, then looks at Benoit and goes, get him. And they start stomping. Oh my God, I get chills right now remembering it, because again, I was in the audience. The crowd went nuts for this at the time. Then the Dungeon of Doom came down, and everybody's like, oh my goodness. I remember Dusty Rhodes when I went to watch the videotape. Back in those days, we had to wait like 3 months to get to see it if you went to the pay-per-view. But I remember seeing the videotape later, and remember Dusty Rhodes going, somebody get my medicine, because it was so crazy. And that wasn't even the craziest thing that happened that night, because it was also the same night, depending on how you feel about this, that Steve Mongo McMichael joined as the fourth Horseman, which to some people, they hated it. To other people, I thought it was appropriate. I think Steve McMichael was a perfect kind of like, brute, blunt instrument. He kind of fit the Horseman. He had that kind of southern, rich, elitist, he was a former Chicago Bear. He's a Super Bowl champion. He had that kind of swagger about him that, oddly enough, fit with the Horsemen, especially that group of the Horsemen, which, by the way, Ric Flair does say it was one of his favorite incarnations of the Horsemen when it was him, Chris Benoit, Arn Anderson, Steve McMichael, Woman, Elizabeth, and even Deborah. I'm going to round this out by going back about 7 years before that to another Great American Bash. Yes, also at the Baltimore Arena. Yes, also a show that I was at. It's the Great American Bash 1989, which out of that first 4 sets of Great American Bashes that they had on pay-per-view coming from the Baltimore Arena, 1988 to 1991, this, in my opinion, was the best of the 4. Ric Flair was coming back after being pile-driven on a table by Terry Funk following his tremendous win against Ricky Steamboat of the NWA Championship, where I think it was his 6th World Championship win. Funk was upset at the end of Wrestle War that he wasn't getting a title shot, so he pile drove Flair. Flair was out with a neck injury for a couple of months. This was Flair's big return, and for the first time in my life as a wrestling fan, as an NWA Crockett fan, I was getting to see Ric Flair as a face. And this would start a pretty solid feud for the rest of the year between Flair and Funk and a couple other guys that would be involved in the feud. But Flair and Funk's match, which I still wonder to this day, given what recently happened with AEW in Baltimore, where they got, thank you Chris Cruz, where they got fined for blood in the match, and the year before this one at the Great American Bash 88, where they legitimately stopped the main event match because Lex Luger bled, but they worked it into the storyline. Why is it on this show that Flair and Funk bled all over the place in the main event? The match didn't get stopped. I didn't hear about them getting fined for it. I don't know. So if anybody out there knows the reason why this show they got away with it and the other shows they didn't, somebody let me know. But it's a great main event. But this card was just great. You had a War Games match with Dr. Death Steve Williams, the Road Warriors, and the Midnight Express against the Fabulous Freebirds and the Samoan SWAT team. I mean, that alone would have just got me right there. You had Lex Luger taking on Ricky Steamboat for the U.S. Championship. You had the dud of the night, which was the opening battle royal. It was one of those multi-ring battle royals that WCW used to do all the time that never really worked. I think it was the King of Cable or King of something or other. That was the only bad match on the show. The rest of the show was pretty awesome. Sid Vicious, very early in his career, teaming up with Dan Spivey as a very impressive tag team at the time. The Skyscrapers basically demolishing the Dynamic Dudes. And if you don't remember who the Dynamic Dudes were, yeah, it was Shane Douglas and somebody we all know today is Johnny Ace, but we also know as Head of Talent Relations, John Laurinaitis. But I will say, as a kid at the time, I think I was, 12 years old at the time, the match I was most looking forward to on this show was the World Television Championship match, as Sting, who was my favorite wrestler at the time and had the paint and everything else, was taking on the Great Muta, who was a Japanese wrestler with a different kind of face paint, and they were kind of like these mirror opposites of each other. So just the visual of the two of them going up against each other was pretty cool. Even their movesets were kind of similar but different. And the controversial dusty finish of the match, however. But it was a great show, and the two of them would later factor into the Flair and Funk feud, which would lead to them having a lot of matches, as it was Flair and Sting teaming up to take on Gary Hart's charges of the J-Tech Corporation, I think they called it, Terry Funk, the Great Muta, and a couple other guys that were involved with it. But Great American Bash 1989, if you want to go back and look at some old Crockett, the old school 80s Great American Bashes from the post-Crockett era, this is probably the best one up until we get to the Monday Night Wars. But that's my list of 10, really 11, pay-per-views that you should definitely have watched as a wrestling fan. But of course, this is just my list, just my opinion. And it's heavily skewed by the fact that I was in attendance at a lot of these shows. But I want to know what your list is. Let your voice be heard in the comment box below. Until next time, I'll see you guys here for more news, rumors, and countdowns on the Rantin Review Pro Wrestling. Have a good day.